All right, Jeff, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sweet. All right. Now the
Do I
last,
sound okay? Can you hear me okay?
yeah, we can hear you pretty loud and clear, which is good.
Awesome.
And I believe we're just going to get your video up on the screen so we can all see your pretty face. Cool. All right. Awesome. All right, guys. For those of you who don't know, and I don't know why I bother, this is Jeff Way. You all know of Jeff. So I thought I'd just give you a round of applause and thanks for joining us tonight, mate. Cool. So, as I understand, Jeff, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
As I understand, it's a bit of a
Do I sound okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you pretty loud and clear, which is good. And I believe we're just going to get your video up on the screen so we can all see your pretty face. Cool. All right. All right, mate. You can hear that, obviously. All right, guys. For those of you who don't know, and I don't know why I bother, this is Jeff Way.
I'm hearing this delayed response. Okay, there we go.
Right. We had someone streaming on the same computer that we were running it.
Yeah, because I'm hearing a bunch of music, and then I heard what we were talking about 2 minutes ago.
Replaying it after about 30 seconds, and that was really weirding us out. Sorry for those of you who are on YouTube and didn't want to hear the same talk delayed, but that was weird. That was like when you're like watching the football and listening to the football on the radio at the stadium. That was anyway, guys. So, all right. So this is Jeff. So basically, what we're going to be doing is just a little bit of a. I'm just going to throw some questions out, and then I'm hoping you guys have got some questions to ask as well. Anything you wanted to ask, or you can heckle him because he can't really get you because he's a long way away. Yeah, but I appreciate you getting up so early, mate. That's that's really nice. So, I guess we'll start with the obvious. Just a little bit of your background, I guess. Could you tell us about, as a developer, where you started? Because some people might not know, but you've actually got a bit of a history with Australia.
Yeah, I do. Okay, there we go. So I'm sorry, there was a bunch of music in my ear, I guess, coming from your end, but it seems to be gone now.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, I worked for an Australian company for like 5 years. I got started, I don't know, what was it, like 2005. But I went and did tons of stuff, you know, like everyone does. I started out doing like little freelance projects, just terrible freelance projects that I'm embarrassed about. Then I worked for like a medical company making the most like websites for the most boring medical gear you've ever seen that sells for like $2 million a pop, though, you know, those X-ray machines and stuff. And then I started working for Envato. And as I understand it, Envato is like the #1 site on Alexa for Australia. It's huge now. But when I joined Envato, if you're not familiar with Envato, they run like the Touch Plus network. They run all of the digital marketplaces like ThemeForest and Code Canyon. So yeah, I joined them in 2008, and I basically headed up NetTouch. NetTouch doesn't even exist anymore. It's just called Touch Plus. But back then, you may know there was a site called NetTouch, which is just web development. Go ahead, Ben.
I said there was really good content back then too.
Yeah, I don't keep up on it much anymore these days. But yeah, back in the day, NetTouch was awesome. There just wasn't. It's weird. Like these days, we're kind of like, when it comes to web development education, there are so many resources. But back then in 2007, there really wasn't. It was bad. Like all you had was lynda.com, and all lynda.com did was post Dreamweaver videos. Like that was it. And so for everything else, you just had to go to the bookstore and spend $80 on, you know, some kind of CSS book. So yeah, I joined Envato. I worked for NetTouch for years, helped build up that network. And then recently, I guess about 1.5 years ago, I quit and started Laracasts.
Hey, I thought that was longer than 1.5 years. Geez, that flew. And I think I was just reminiscing a bit myself. That was where I think I first spoke to you. It was a I don't know if you remember, it was a roundtable with regards to how exceptions should be used for control flow.
Oh, really?
And, I don't know. It's one of those things I remember because it was like one of my first sort of first moments on the interwebs where I put my name out there. So that was kind of.
Oh, yes, I do remember this. Yeah, it was the only roundtable I ever did for NetTouch, and Phil Sturgeon got pissed off about it. I remember. Is that right, Ben?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I'm just assuming based on odds. that he would have got pissed off about something. But yeah, no, it was based on someone had picked on my code. Actually, it was I was using exceptions a lot in Sentry, and I was using it to catch like not so much exceptions, but actually handle multiple states coming back from the one higher end method. And it was basically it must have been about 10 or 15 of us, and half of them were like, yeah, that's kind of cool, and half of them were like, you know, he's the devil. But it was all right. Yeah, that was fun. And so I guess when did you first realize, obviously it was before Laracasts, that you were interested in Laravel, you started sort of dipping into it over coding?
Sure. Again, real quick, I'm getting really loud music in my ear. Okay, now it's going away. It's weird. Whenever you're talking, I'm hearing really loud music from your end. Anyways.
I don't know. There's no music playing here whatsoever.
It's only when you talk. That makes no sense. When you stop talking, Ben, I don't hear music. But when you do talk, I hear like R&B music pretty loud. That's the weirdest thing I've ever... Anyways.
Well, there's that's not an iPad. It's some sort of inferior product.
It's gone now. It's gone now. Whatever somebody did, it's totally gone now.
So just as a bit of, I don't know why, but I'll tell you, we just worked out that there's an iPad or some sort of thing here that was playing music. For some reason, you probably can tell we're not very good with the whole wiring up and that. So when I talk, for some reason, this thing's playing through your headset. So no longer. Is it good now?
Yeah, no, it's perfect. Okay, what got me interested in Laravel?
Yeah.
I can tell you the one thing. If you check out Laravel and you look at the source code, this is basically common knowledge to anyone who uses Laravel at this point. But if you're somewhat new to it, if you look at any comment in the Laravel source code, you'll see that Taylor follows this convention where the first line is like 100 characters, the second line is 97 characters, and the third line is 94 characters. So every line is 3 characters less than the one that precedes it. Yeah. It's the most insane thing that you've ever seen. It kind of like blew my mind the first time I saw it, because this is something that affects literally nothing, and Taylor is putting that much care into it. And I think a lot of people would say that's a waste of time. That's superfluous. You know, your time is much better spent working on code, you know, that actually makes a difference, code that actually gets executed. But from my point of view, it's like, man, this guy is so focused on the code base that he cares about the way a comment looks. Yeah. And if you go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say he does. I remember actually it was in the Laravel 4 beta days, and I actually pointed out just through an issue that he'd not done that in one of his comments. It didn't line up. It was like it went line and then it had 1 down, then it went 4 down, and it just wasn't even. And I just said, oh, no good. And then he fixed it.
No, I've even seen pull requests where people will add something and they add the comments, but they don't follow that convention, and that's worthy of, you know, a rejected pull request. Not really. I guess he can fix it.
I think I've seen that, but yeah. So there you go, guys. If any of you put in a pull request with Laravel, make sure those bloody comments line up. Otherwise, you might.
I'm just kidding. I'm sure he would merge it and then fix it himself. According to him, he can do it really fast these days. For me, I built and manage Laravel Elixir, so that's kind of my area of Laravel. And I try to follow the convention, and it's freaking hard. And according to him, he can do it in 5-10 seconds. But for me, it's like really, really hard to make everything line up. And I always end up cheating where one is like 4 characters. But yeah. Anyways, it doesn't make any difference to the code base, but it just shows like there's a level of care put into the framework that I had never seen before, especially in the PHP world. And then beyond that, it's like, because Taylor switched over to PHP from the .NET world, he wasn't kind of held back by some of the constraints that the rest of us had who had been using PHP since version 4. So there's just things he didn't even know about. Like, he didn't know about kind of the dark days of PHP 4. He, I think, started PHP with 5.3. I think maybe 5.2. Maybe 5.2. But either way, it's like he was able to, like, I don't know, he was able to skip over all the crap that we had to deal with, you know? And so I feel like it kind of freed up his mind where he, you know, Laravel was kind of one of the first PHP frameworks to really embrace anonymous function or closures, which you would with saying PHP. You didn't see that in CodeIgniter, you know? Laravel was one of the first ones to do it, and it just felt natural. Laravel feels so good. And so once I saw a lot of this stuff, I realized very quickly it was something I wanted to put the time into.
I saw, I'm guessing that was your inspiration for that tweet you put out. It must have been before you went to bed last night, where you were talking about companies that seemingly waste their time on small detail, like Apple with the notebooks and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's very, very interesting, isn't it? It's very, it goes to speak a lot of their overall attitude more than anything, I think, is that attention to what is seemingly irrelevant, but to them it matters.
Yeah. No, yeah. I made that tweet because I'm speaking at both Laracons this year. It's going to be the same talk, but one in the US and one in Amsterdam. And that's kind of one of the things I'm talking about. I'm talking in general, like, about simplicity. That's something I'm really into these days, is sort of like the art of simplicity. And what's funny about that is, like, writing simple code is ridiculously hard. And you'd think it would be the other way around, you know? Writing complicated, complex code is hard. Writing simple code is hard, you know? So one of the things I'm kind of taking a look at is all the different industries where you see these companies and these projects where they put so much care into things that you would never see. If you take, I'll try to tweet that link that you're referring to later. A few people gave me some really good examples. One of my examples, of course, like you said, was if you open up a MacBook, it's just beautiful on the inside. It's good coloring, black and silver. Everything is lined out really nicely. It's beautiful. If you were to look at other laptops, especially back in the day, they were a mess. They were green, they were ugly. You know, I read an interview where some of the Apple engineers were almost talking about those other laptop innards, like, oh my God, how embarrassing for them that they don't take care into this. Some guy told me earlier about Pixar, and one of their, you know, Pixar, the movie studio, and one of their rules is, what is it? Work on the, I'm not going to remember it, work on the underside of the desk, or something like that. Basically meaning nobody will ever see the underside of the desk when they watch the movie, but still put care into that. And that's something I'm really interested in, focusing on the things that seemingly don't matter, but then kind of in retrospect matter more than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. So on a day-to-day basis, I mean, yeah, you've got Elixir's your sub project, sub baby, whatever you want to call it, within Laravel. As far as do you find inspiration, or do you collaborate with Taylor as far as, say, the content on Laracasts and things like that? Is that something you guys are talking like every day, or you'll go, you know, a couple of days without saying boo?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say like I run everything on Laracasts by Taylor, not even remotely. But Taylor and I probably talk every day. We had this kind of group where a few of us just kind of, you know, the water cooler, because a lot of us work from home. So, you know, we just talk about general stuff. Taylor runs some ideas by us all the time, something he's working on. Like there's I can't talk to it, I'm not allowed to, but there's like a couple of things he's working on, I assume for Laravel 5.2, and he kind of runs it by us for ideas. On the flip side, for Laracasts, I kind of keep him all right, I'll tell you one thing I did wrong with Laracasts. When this was back when we first launched, Taylor was working on Laravel 4.3 at the time, and I was really into, like, for Laracast, I wanted to be the only site that would keep you up to date on what was coming. You know, you go to other sites like Tuts or Lynda, and it's like you get good content, but it's just, you know, it's not really current, especially when it comes to frameworks. So I wanted Laracast to be completely current. But the problem is, I was doing these videos on Laravel 4.3 sort of in real time. Taylor would sort of tell me, yeah, this is ready to go. So I'm doing all these videos. And then, as some of you may know, suddenly Taylor decided, well, it's not going to be 4.3 because he wanted to kind of do a little bit more. So he bumped it up to Laravel 5.0. And then he basically changed everything. So now I have all these videos on the site for Laravel 4.3, and they're basically all just completely and instantly dated. So I realized from that point, like, you can't be too cutting edge, right? Or you just waste everyone's time because it's going to change. So I worked out with him a deal where it's like he gives me permission when I can post about a particular new feature, and I don't cover it until then. And that way it works out. Because otherwise, like, if you do it too soon, then people watch the videos, they try to use some of these new features. They're not necessarily ready to be used yet, but they use them, and then suddenly you're creating tons of GitHub issues, and it creates a lot more work for him. So yeah, it's completely understandable.
Yeah, I had a project we did. It was must have been October or November last year, something like that. And it was on Laravel 5 or 4.3/5/5 beta or whatever. And it was using your Commander package. It was using annotation, all that sort of stuff. And it was just been the last couple of weeks that we've decided, okay, time to move to 5.1. But it's like all of this stuff, and it was just this growing debt that we've got now because we couldn't update one thing without updating the other thing. It was just like, which I think 5.1 actually is a huge incentive for business people to actually adopt the framework, being long term. But I guess there's something you said before which I was quite interested in, because I'm doing a talk later tonight regarding that. Was when you and Taylor have both effectively done the same thing. You've been working for big companies. Well, not Taylor, not so much a big company, but you've been working for other people in a secure, reliable sort of a job. Then you've both gone out and started your own thing. Did you find it like scary, or like was there any advice you could give to anyone who's considering going freelancing or that sort of thing?
Yeah.
One more thing to further add to that, which you could include in your answer, would be so you've gone out and done it, and what maybe some of the things that surprised you in a good way about running your own gig that you didn't expect that were going to happen?
Sure. Okay. First, my advice would be continue with caution if you want to do it too. It's it worked out well for me, and it very easily could have turned out really badly. When I worked at Envato, I'd been there for like 5 years, so I had a good salary, right? So I was walking away from a good salary to try out something on my own that very well could have crashed and burned. So it's like, I feel like it's almost a risk that you can only take when you're pretty young. I don't have kids yet. I'm just married, no kids. If I had kids, I don't think I ever would have done it. So not saying you shouldn't do it if you have kids, but I don't know if I would have had the guts to try it out, because this is something when I decided to leave Envato, and the reason I left Envato is for a number of reasons. A lot of it, I was starting to get burned out there. A lot of it was I was just doing the same job over and over, and I didn't feel like I was learning. That's a big thing. You want to feel like you're working on new stuff, and you want to feel like you're growing as a developer and learning new things. And I just felt like it had stopped. And I feel like once you get to that point where you're just doing the same thing every day, it's time to start looking for something new. But anyways, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, going out to start Laracasts. It's been the most rewarding thing I've ever done, and the most tiring thing I've ever done. Like when I worked at Envato, it's like you have your one job and that's it. But when you go out on your own, especially like it's just me at Laracasts, I could hire developers, and Laracasts like desperately wants more people working on the site, but I would rather like not do that as long as I can, because then you have to deal with payroll and it just becomes a nightmare, right? Like I like building things. I don't necessarily like being a manager, and then you have to worry about like marketing and reporting and reviewing data and working with accountants, and it just becomes like a nightmare. And so I think you have to be careful. We're developers, we're not necessarily business owners, and it's sometimes really hard to make that transition. I think I was lucky that I had a gut feeling that Laravel was going to get really big. So when I launched Laracasts, Laravel was, it was gaining traction, but it was still relatively small. And luckily since then, Laracasts has just kind of gone through the roof. I'm sorry, Laravel has gone through the roof, and the site has been able to ride that a little bit.
It's you're putting a lot of trust. I don't know if trust is the word, but you're banking a lot on Laravel making it, because if it doesn't, you could rebrand as PHP Tuts or something like that, and I'm sure it will work. But your brand that people know is based on Laravel stuff. Though, I mean, in fact, that's a great lead into my next question, which was quite often these days, a lot of the things you're talking about, even from the start, a lot of the things you're talking about, except for specific Laravel features, are usable in the wider PHP community. And heck, some of this stuff is not even dependent on PHP, right? So what do you find the most rewarding, not rewarding, but what do you find the most interesting tools, the things that intrigue you the most these days? Is it, I know you're doing a lot, and I don't know how to say it, Vue.js or Vue.js?
Vue.js.
all of those sort of things, which really aren't anything to do with Laravel, let alone PHP.
No, they aren't.
So, like, what's your thoughts on how that's shaping out and how it's changing?
Yeah, that's one thing. Like, I've been criticized for that, where people are like, "Why would you link your site to Laravel when you kind of cover lots of stuff?" And it's like, I get that argument. At the same time, it very much was the right choice to go with Laracasts rather than something like PHP Casts. I'm positive of that, just in terms of branding, being connected to Laravel, riding that wave. But it's true, like Laracast covers tons of stuff, because the reality is Laravel is, for most of us, one small piece of what we work on, right? You're writing JavaScript, you're writing CSS, you're writing tons of stuff, command line applications and all that stuff. It's not necessarily connected to Laravel, but we all still have to do that. So in my opinion, it warrants a place on the site. The big thing I'm into right now, not necessarily library-based, well, Vue.js 100%. And I feel like Vue.js is the Laravel of JavaScript by far. It's like, and it's, it's funny, nobody is talking about it really. And that's another one. I just have this gut feeling Vue.js is going to be huge in a year. I feel like it's just on the cusp. I don't know. It's funny. Everyone talks about React. I like React. I think React is really great. You hear about Ember a lot, but one interesting thing, like if you think about Ember, probably lots of people there use Ember. The branding, at least to me, the branding comes across as sort of like the JavaScript framework for ambitious applications. And I feel like that immediately writes off a lot of people who think, well, what I'm working on isn't that ambitious. I'm just working on something for my company. I would like to use this, but I get the feeling this is kind of, unless I'm building GrooveShark or something, I shouldn't be using that. I guarantee that's not the case, but that's sort of how the branding comes across. And anyways, you go to the sites and they're just difficult to learn. This stuff is so difficult. And by the time you learn one framework, you're being told that this other framework is way better, right? Yeah. It's kind of a nightmare right now. Vue.js is one of the few libraries or frameworks, whatever you want to call it. You go to the website, it's beautiful, like Laravel. You go to the documentation, it's perfectly succinct. You can learn it in 2 hours. It's so nice to work with. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think it's really, really great. So I'm using it quite a bit these days.
That's, I guess that's something else, is developers these days. There is a plethora of different tools. I mean, just to, well, actually, here's an example related to Laravel. So when, as you know, you wrote it, Elixir lets is basically a task manager, right? It's a nice wrapper for Gulp. And then you install, so like you install Laravel, use Composer. Then you install your dependencies, use Node. And then you install your Bower components, Node components, run Elixir, and then I guess run Artisan Server, run a web server. And then you've got things like Vue that you might want to wrap your, you've got a client-side filler, you've got a really active client. There's all these tools, and it just becomes really overbearing, I guess. And I feel that's becoming a bit of a necessity these days, that you just have to know these tools to be a developer. And even the backlash, and I was very verbal with it when Taylor or whoever decided that the entire Bootstrap framework should be put inside the Laravel application base, and then Laravel was recognized as a JavaScript and CSS framework according to GitHub. Because of the code scans. So, there's that, but that removed the need to use that tool. But on the flip side, so all of these tools do make your life easy, but they can certainly make it a lot harder. How do you feel that devs need to be learning all these tools these days? Really, don't they? It's inevitable, really.
Yeah, it sucks. You know what I think developers and podcasts don't talk enough about? Just how difficult it is. Everyone's talking about like, architecture and design. Everyone references like the Red Book and the Blue Book, principles of enterprise application architecture, whatever. People are referencing that so much. And it's like, I feel like everyone listening is completely overwhelmed by how much there is to learn, but nobody talks about it that much. Yeah. And it's like, especially like back in the day, here's the great thing, why I chose PHP over something else doesn't amount to much more than the fact that it was just so easy to use. And I think most people would say that. So many things you have to figure out some kind of development environment. With PHP, you just create a file and you push it up to a server and you're good to go, right? That's like, once again, that's just an example of how like simplicity always wins. PHP is not nearly as elegant to use as something like Ruby, not even close, but it wins. The simplest option almost always wins. And I feel like that's why Laravel is popular. That's why I'm betting on Vue being popular. I totally forgotten your question, Ben. What was it again?
My question, yeah, was it's sort of what you're talking about is how.
Oh yeah, yeah, got it. Okay. Sorry, it's super early. It's like 5 in the morning here. Do developers need to learn all this stuff? Yeah, it sucks because you have to. Back in the day, you just wrote some HTML, you wrote some CSS, and you were done, right? Those were like kind of the great days when it was all learnable. Back then, it was all learnable. Now it's almost impossible, especially like. It's nice if you have an area where it's like, this is your area of expertise, this is all you focus on. But I feel like a lot of us, or at least on our side projects, we are doing everything. You're doing the coding, you're doing the server admin, you're doing the CSS, you're doing the design, you're doing the JavaScript. You know, it's like, is it any wonder that people just get burned out and leave the industry? And I hear about that a lot. I think there's simply no way around it. You have to learn this stuff. I don't think you have to learn it all at once, but for me, I've been doing this for like over a decade, and I swear to God, it's just been nonstop. Like every day, I've been learning a little bit, and I think all of us are that way. It's like you just kind of never stop working on stuff. Sometimes I think about like, God, I wish I was just working at Starbucks or something where you make coffee for 8 hours and you go home and you literally don't think about it at all. And I think for us, it's like you do your day job, and then you go home and you either work on side projects, or maybe you're hoping you'll go out on your own eventually. So you're working on these projects. On the weekend, if you have time, you're trying to work on stuff, but you're also trying to fit in time to buy books and watch videos and keep up on your skills. It's a really hard industry. But that's why you really have to love it, I think. Like you have to want to do this for fun, because if you don't, man, you'll get passed by really quickly.
Absolutely. Just have it. I mean, even especially the JavaScript world, man. I have tried with Node.js, and that just for the hell of it, it just moves too fast for me. It's like almost daily it's different, but certainly weekly there's so much that changes. But mate, what I was thinking we'd do at this point is there's a whole bunch of people here, and I'm hoping some people have questions, and I haven't asked them all. So if there's anyone here who has a question for Jeff, make yourself known, and you can come up and ask. Otherwise, I'll keep going. So. Timing. Oh, you got times, yes.
Question on Meetup.
I'll just put. Oh, perfect. Yeah. Awesome. And guys, just remember, if you don't want to jump up and ask, like and be super world famous on the interwebs, feel free to write your question on Meetup, on the web page, on the Meetup page, and I'll ask it on your behalf. So I don't know how to turn the phone on, but I have got Meetup here. So the first question is. Here we go. So we've already sort of covered your view on AngularJS or on Ember.js anyway. Maybe could you give a really concise comparison actually between AngularJS and Vue and what you find? Because I quite like Angular. I've never used Vue. A really concise comparison against like 3 things that Vue beats, or maybe that Angular beats Vue on, or something like that.
A cool thing to know is the guy who built Vue.js. He's based in China. I can't think of his name. I'm a terrible person. Anyways, he worked at Google. So he worked on the Google team. He might have worked on the Angular team. I'm not sure. But it's very clear, and he would be the first to admit that Vue is very much inspired and inherits from Angular. I think both are great. Angular is awesome. Angular was kind of one of the, well, not really the first, because you had Knockout, and Knockout was doing cool stuff, and then a lot of people switched over to Angular. So much of what they do is the same. I feel like in a lot of key areas, it's hard to be specific. In a lot of key areas, I feel like Vue.js just chooses the simpler option. I think Angular very much focuses on things like dependency injection, and that's all really great. But then it also comes, and this is true for like everything, it gives you that extra flexibility and testability, but it kind of comes at the cost of readability a little bit. I'm trying to think of.
When you were comparing it to Laravel, you were saying it has that edge that just has that feel that like just that little bit more attention to detail in maybe from the perspective of a developer using it. It just feels that little bit more polished from a developer.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it just feels like a little more thought went into some of the method names. Some of the it's less verbose. Less verbose is always good. Plenty of people would disagree with me on that one, but yeah. It's always comes down to like the little things, right? The little things that don't matter, I keep finding matter more than everything. Just even the little syntax things. And that's where some people are like, oh, it doesn't cost much to just inject this or reference a factory here rather than newing this up right, in the method or whatever. And it's like, yes, that's true, but just remember every one of those changes comes with a cost. And it may not feel like a strong cost, but when you do that 100 times over, before you know it, you have like a really complex application that you have trouble just sorting through. And it wasn't one thing. It was 100 tiny decisions that made it a little more complex. So yeah, I just feel like Vue.js compared to Angular, both are great. You can't go wrong with either. A big knock, at least for me, against Angular is they announced 2.0. I'm sure it's way better, but it was like completely different. And I think so much steam was let out when they announced that, because everyone's like, oh my gosh, I just built this application here. And now the next version of this is completely different and I'm going to have to rewrite it.
Like the Kahana 2, Kahana 3 days,
Exactly. Wow. And it's hard for that. I was talking to Taylor about this just today, but funnily enough. It must be hard because they have these ideas of how they can make their framework better. But it's a constant battle against the users. And it's like, I don't want to break compatibility and piss everyone off, but I think these changes would be worth it, So it must be very hard to manage that at all times. Yes, you have a major release. It can be breaking, but it's like, if you have a large enough user base, you're really going to piss people off. And that's happened to Laravel a few times, upgrading from Laravel 3 to 4, kind of ridiculous. You just kind of had to, I don't even know what the upgrade guide for that would have been. I think you just had to create a new, I can't remember. Yeah. Laravel 4 to 5 was basically create a new install of Laravel 5 and just slowly migrate your files over. Even still, it's like an hour to do all of that. I still think it's worth it. It's like if every year and a half you can spend, let's say, a day tops upgrading to the latest and best version of the framework, then it's worth it. But yeah, it's a constant struggle, I think.
So I've got a question, and I don't know if anyone is watching on YouTube, but you might get some trolls on Twitter saying, burning with fire. But actually, I did want to ask, active record or data mapper?
Active record.
Okay.
Totally.
I won't dig into that because we'll start getting abuse on Twitter.
On this note, real quick. Okay, yeah. So when I was getting ready for this, I watched your meetup where you had Taylor on just to see what the format was like.
Yeah.
And some guy asks a question for Taylor, 2-minute question. He knocks me 3 times, and he completely misquoted me and misrepresented what I thought. So I have to defend myself here real quick. His one question was he asked Taylor what his thoughts were on TDD and whether he's on the DHH side or the Jeffrey Way side. That's complete BS. I completely agree with DHH when it comes to TDD. And when it comes to testing, I'm completely... I think a lot of people get confused. DHH wasn't saying that testing is bad. Not even remotely was he saying that. He was saying the idea that you're not a professional developer unless you are doing test-first development, that's a myth. And that's what he was saying. I completely agree with that. All right, I don't even necessarily think it's a myth. I think it's a decision that just depends upon what you're building. I found lots of areas where doing a TDD approach works flawlessly. It's like it was perfectly made for that process. And I found other things where it just doesn't work. So he might be in the audience there. I'd like to see him if he is. But he said a bunch of things where it's like, wow, I didn't say any of that, and I don't think that whatsoever. He sort of made it out like I'm a big fan of complexity, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Oh,
you can't see them. There's about 14 Jeff haters just out of your camera there. There's a whole... They've even got banners saying we hate you. I don't know who it was, but yeah, it's easy to get misquoted, isn't it? I guess the thing is maybe people know that you've done a few talks on testing, and they also don't listen to the very thing you say, where it all depends on context, right?
All depends on context, because testing is good. I'm not sure anyone actually thinks testing is bad, right? It's just whether it's, I think there's a group of people who have very specific ideas on this is the right way to make applications. And I feel like you have to be very careful about that. And a lot of these people would say, unless you are writing a test before every piece of production code you write, then, like I said, you're not a professional developer. I couldn't disagree with that more, but to each their own.
We have a question from Marius. He's saying, wondering what your plans are on this whole, the whole architecture. I almost said fad. It's not a fad. The wave that's coming through, this whole architecture sort of stuff in PHP. Your DDD, CQRS, events, all that sort of stuff. Have you is that something you're going to go down the path of on Laracast, or is that something that's I would personally feel really intimidated by talking about that, because I've tried it, but I really feel I don't know a lot, and it's very it's I don't want to use the word elitist. No, I do. It's very elitist. There's a lot of elitism I feel that surrounds a lot of that. And that's a bit of a barrier to entry. Maybe that's a good reason to make something on Laracast, but it's, you know, it's also putting your sort of your head in the firing squad, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult, because it's like, well, it's good to know, like, what is CQRS? It would be good to have a video to explain what it is. But the problem with that, especially like Laracast has a pretty good mix of beginners and advanced users, but it doesn't change the fact that a lot of people will watch that and instantly think, I need to be using CQRS in my applications. And the reality is I've never done it, you know? I think once again, there is a small minority of people who are very vocal on Twitter and at conferences. And I don't know, I feel like PHP, I said this in another podcast recently, where I feel like PHP is in its teenage years, kind of. We are like, the community is just ridiculously better than it was back in 2005. If any of you were coding back then, it was a dark time for PHP. Now it's really good, but I feel like people are also just going through the Red Book and Blue Book, and they're basically saying, like, it's almost like they treat it like the Bible, right? Yeah. This is the one way to build applications, and if you don't follow these rules specifically, then we're going to point out where you went wrong in this book, and we're going to call you out on Reddit and Twitter and all of that stuff. And it's absurd. And I feel like the conversation has been kind of skewed, where a lot of these people will say, well, yeah, Active Record, to use Active Record, because Active Record kind of flies in the face of a lot of these techniques from the Blue Book and the Red Book. Anyways, they'll say, like, yeah, Active Record's good for small projects, but for anything, you know, of anything of real value, then Active Record's just gonna fly out the window. And it's like, that it's just not true. You know, I built lots of applications. Laracast is about 40,000 lines of code. I bet that's probably pretty standard, but it kind of gets skewed where people act like, yeah, for real projects, it just breaks down very quickly. And it's like, no, a lot of the data mapper is fine. You know, you have to base it on a project by project basis. But I would say for your typical project, Active Record will not be your bottleneck. When I think about things that are my bottleneck, they have nothing to do with that. They have to do with just concepts more related to the domain. It doesn't have to do with, I really shouldn't be, you know, treating this as an eloquent model or whatever. I don't know. I would say, I'm rambling here. I would say the majority of applications, Active Record is fine. If you're building something really large where it breaks down, of course, use Data Mapper. But don't fall into the trap of thinking for your typical application, using the Active Record pattern is going to hurt you, because I've just never seen it happen.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And guys in the audience, if there's any more questions, because we've got one more. We've only got a couple more minutes, but if there's any more questions, ask now. So I have got, of course, Zach. Yeah, okay, so I've got a question from Zach, and right, and it's what I thought it would be. So with all of these tools, you know, where we're talking about more interactive client-side apps and things like that, the question is, and I think I know the answer you're about to say, but do you see Laravel itself becoming more of a REST first framework? So sort of stripping down a lot of that other stuff and becoming REST first, and maybe you add those things in, whether it be by that Laravel Collect or Lara Collective or whatever it's called. You know, may maintain all those other components, or how do you see that? Or do you think it will always be your traditional, you know, full stack framework?
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm honestly curious about that. It feels like it's going that direction, doesn't it? A good example is this. If we're going to go back to Rails again, DHH, his kind of example application for how he thinks Rails is best used is Basecamp. He talks about this all the time. And he'll say, the closer what you're building is to something like Basecamp, it doesn't mean it has to be Basecamp, but in that kind of feel, right? The closer what you're building is to that, the more Rails will be suitable for you. And I have to believe Taylor does the same thing with Laravel. So much of Laravel is completely just stripped out of what Taylor needed to build for, well, at least when he worked for Snappy, when he worked on the Snappy project, a lot of that came. The migrations, they wanted to use migrations, so he built migrations. He put that into Laravel so he could use it on his main application. Pretty basic, standard stuff, makes perfect sense. If you look at what he's building now, things like Laravel Forge and Laravel Envoy, those are pretty front-end heavy stuff. I think I don't think he's using Vue on those yet, even though he's a fan of Vue these days. I think those use Angular. But anyways, go ahead.
I was just saying, Forge is Angular. That was just my sorry. That was my little comment.
No, you're good. Yeah, but if you look at those, they're Angular heavy applications, and I would imagine he's mostly treating the back end very much just like a REST API. And so and you can kind of tell some of the stuff makes it pretty easy, actually. Things like if you return an eloquent call from your controller, it immediately gets cast to JSON. Good for APIs, or especially APIs that only Taylor would be consuming and stuff like that. But I am curious to see if things go more and more in that direction. I don't know if Laravel can evolve, but I don't know. On the other hand, go ahead, Ben.
Where I was going to say was things like Lumen and that are a sort of a stripped down, but then Lumen doesn't have a lot of the other components you'd still want as an API sort of a service, right? So I was thinking, the way I see it happening, maybe, and it would take, I think it would have to just the pure following of Laravel, right? It would take maybe a couple of years, but I could see actually Laravel itself becoming less full stack and actually having not just individual add-ons, but maybe like Laravel / full stack, or something that would include things like your Vue and your and I'm trying to think of something else. Maybe some of those things like where it I can't think of anything else actually. No, like you know what I mean. Maybe there's not a whole lot that has to come out just to be a web service, like an API sort of thing. But I could see maybe. In my perfect world, it would be more stripped and you would add things in. But then again, that goes against the philosophy is easy. As a developer, if I want to spit out of Vue, now I've got to then require another component and all this sort of stuff, right?
Exactly.
And even with that, I think people get caught up in the whole, it's bloated. But at the end of the day, if you're not loading the class, it doesn't matter. Like, so what if there's, all these vendor folders and all this loaded in? What's not being used in your specific app isn't going to affect your app, right? And I think it's just irrelevant.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. You see it on Twitter all the time where people are talking about like kind of scraping up your own custom framework using packages. And it's like, on one hand, that's cool, right? It's so cool that we now have an ecosystem where you can do that. And it's cool for some projects, but once again, I get the feeling that some people think that's what I need to be doing. If I'm starting this new project, Laravel is bloated or Symfony is bloated. Instead, I should just be building up my own framework and I'll just get this package and piece everything together. And it's like, for me, for most typical applications you're building, why would you want to do that? It's like, okay, it's really cool that you could pick your Vue engine here, but it's like most of the time the default is what you want. Blade's fine. So why do you want to create that extra work for yourself? It's cool, you can do it if you want, but like that's what Laravel is already. Laravel is a bunch of components pieced together and maybe somewhat opinionated, but other than that, it's like that's kind of what you want for most projects. It has most of the things that you would want for a typical application. So the idea, like, for every project, piece it all together, and that's what we should be recommending to, especially newcomers. Not sure about that.
It's good as I built a really small app today that was purely for the purposes of screening some new developers we're trying to get, and that was just one file.
Right.
Put the league router in, and that was all I needed. I just needed to return a couple of JSON responses. So I thought I'll just pull in a router, single script, done.
Right, and that's what it's perfect for. Right.
I wouldn't try and build up a whole, even a small framework that's handling sessions and handling caching and handling data. But I wouldn't bother with that because I've never met an app yet where Laravel is the bottleneck, or even really any framework, maybe Zend or something, but. Nearly any framework, I don't see it's really ever the bottleneck. Even when you start to scale, it's usually things like databases, right?
Yep.
So I don't see that even the bloated thing or that it's going to be slow. It's not. The reality is it's not. I'd be open to a challenge to prove me otherwise, but I haven't seen that as an issue where Laravel is the bottleneck in your app because it's so much more bloated than pulling together your own caching layer, your own database layer, your own view layer, your own router layer, your own request layer, all of those things. It's just all, yeah.
And I wonder if sometimes people have these illusions that their projects are going to be so big where they have to worry about, is Laravel slow? That's the first thing they need to worry about. And it's like, unless you're at a really high level, you probably don't ever need to worry about how fast Laravel is. For what most people are building, they're not that big. I would say most people are building projects 30,000 lines of code or less. Most of them. You have the big ones, and those have special cases. But for most of us, it's like that's not your bottleneck. And you know what? Before you worry about Laravel, worry about the size of your images, right?
Yeah,
that's a little bit more important, probably.
Absolutely. And we just had another question coming now, which was talking about maybe more local to Australia, but I guess the same sort of thing applies. So I'm at school, I'm at uni, whatever. I'm interested in Laravel. I start tinkering around. Now I want to get a job. What's some of the good ways that you can sort of encourage people to sort of maybe like get a job as a junior developer? Like for example, though I wouldn't recommend it as the only means to get yourself exposed, doing open source stuff is really good for your own exposure. You shouldn't go into it with the intention of getting a job out of it, but any recommendations for junior developers who want to get into the field and particularly Laravel?
Yeah, that's hard, right? It's like you want to gain the experience, but you don't have the experience yet, and they won't hire you unless you have the experience. That's why internships are really awesome if you can do it, but who can work for free?
Watch Laracasts, gain the experience, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is true. It's like you just have to put in the work, buy books, go to you don't even have to go to conference. When I was young, I always felt like I needed to go to these conferences in order to stay current. It's like I need to be learning this stuff. I have to go to the conference. And it's like, you know what? That's not true at all. Conferences, at least in my opinion, are like 95% a social thing. My first conference I went to, I expected to just come out and have learned everything, learned all this cool stuff. And I learned absolutely nothing. And you kind of learn like, that's not really the point of a conference. A conference is good for like getting inspired, for meeting people and kind of learning new stuff. It's not necessarily a place you go to train. But yeah, read everything you can find. Just read blogs religiously. One rule I had back in the days, like you have to do it every single day. Even if you're just working 2 hours, you have to learn something every single day. Get involved on Twitter. Twitter maybe is the best thing for my career I've ever done. Yeah. That's the funny thing. So my parents have no understanding of why you would ever use Twitter. And I try to explain to them, actually, Twitter kind of built my career. I got my job at Envato through Twitter. I met Taylor through Twitter, and what's cool about our community, especially, is like we're all nice people. I remember the first time I read a book on CSS by Eric Meyer, and I tweeted him, and he replied to me. And this was like in the early days of Twitter, and I thought that was the coolest thing because I had it in my head that like these writers are like royalty, right? They're like the top of the pack, and nope, they're just people like you and me. He was very cool. So follow these people. That would be my advice, is like find the people, whatever it is you want to learn, find the people who actually built the thing and make friends with them. And you find out they're really cool. They will help you out. They'll give you guidance. And then, of course, like you said, contributing open source, if you can, is such a good way to learn. Even if you're just fixing documentation, that is helpful. Yeah,
absolutely. I think something that I've really sort of picked up on in the last, it would only be months, is the plethora of podcasts these days, and the amount of tools that you learn about. Like, it just might be passing comment that someone says, well, what's that? And go and look at it, and oh, that's cool. And it might not be even relevant for your specific workplace or anything, but it makes for a good night of learning and tinkering and breaking stuff and all of that. But yeah, podcasts for me have been really quite interesting.
Absolutely. It is just, especially for the freelancers or the people getting into this, where it's like you don't work in a company with a bunch of developers you talk to. You're kind of isolated on your own. It's kind of nice to not just listen to other people who are interested in what you're interested in, but you just kind of pick up stuff that you may not know. Full Stack Radio with Adam Wethen. Yeah. Fantastic. Listen to the Laravel podcast if you can. There's like, especially in the PHP world now, there's like a dozen podcasts. Such good stuff is out right now. That's what I mean. Like, PHP is in a really good spot right now. I used to be ashamed to say I worked on PHP because I've done Ruby and JavaScript and stuff like that. But when I would say, oh, this is built in PHP, people would immediately do that. Oh, you're building a toy project. And now I don't care at all. PHP is in a great spot.
Yeah. And mate, we're about to let you go, but I have one last question. What are you drinking in that big, large cup?
First, this is Harry Potter mug, so very, very cool. I'm drinking coffee. It's let's see what time it is right now. It's 5:30 in the morning, so yeah, pretty early here. But yeah, this was fun.
Yeah, no, thanks, mate. We is there any further questions? Anyone want to come up and ask a question? We got negative 5-10 minutes, but one more question if there's anyone. Otherwise, yeah, we've got one. So when you just come up, just introduce yourself and ask away.
Bobby here. Just one question, really. If you're starting off today, so I've probably been coding for about four years. If you start off today, you'd hit Laravel backend, then you could hit Gulp, then you could hit Bower, then you could hit Bootstrap, Node, and you could get all these frameworks, and you could actually put a website together. You've actually not learned any code or any languages.
Mm-hmm.
You're becoming, we're not actually learning the code, but we're actually learning the frameworks.
That's true to some extent. People, way back in the day, this would have been 2008, JavaScript was really hard. I remember I was trying to figure it out, and I would read like 3 chapters, and I'd understand the first 2 chapters, and then chapter 3 would get into like crazy stuff, and I just couldn't follow along. Right at that time, jQuery was released. And jQuery, once again, was kind of like the Laravel of JavaScript back then. You know, you don't have to use it as much these days, but it's still incredibly useful. And I think it was like groundbreaking for that time. I feel like jQuery in many ways is responsible for the huge renaissance that JavaScript had, because it all happened in 2008. And since then, it's gone through the roof, of course. And one of the huge criticisms was jQuery, when you're writing jQuery, you're not writing JavaScript. And you'd see this on Stack Overflow all the time. Like, oh, you're always talking about jQuery. It's not Java. jQuery is specifically JavaScript. Laravel is PHP. It's just a framework where you use PHP. You're still writing PHP. So the idea that you're not learning code if you use something like Laravel, yes, you are. But I would say if you're learning PHP, you don't need to be using Laravel yet. You don't need to be using a framework yet. I feel like a framework is like, get at least a year under your belt, just figuring out, you know, how to connect to a database manually. I bet most of us don't even remember how to connect to a database manually because you're used to using abstractions, right? You have to go back and research it. It's good to learn that stuff. You have to learn the fundamentals first. So I would never recommend that a newcomer start with Laravel. I would say wait a year and then learn it. But it is true. You learn all these tools, and sometimes you're not learning about the concepts as much, but I feel like you just learn it all in the process. You know, I don't think you need to learn Bower, by the way. I don't think you have to memorize Bootstrap and all of that stuff. It's like you can take it one piece at a time. When I was learning this, it's not like I learned all of it at once. It's like you learn something and you get comfortable with it, and then you realize, oh, it would be nice if I had, you know, version control for this. I need to learn Git. And then you learn Git, and then it just continues nonstop, which sucks, but it's just, you know, a tool of the trade. But yeah, it's true. You have to make time for just learning about basic architecture and fundamentals and database design and the core parts of building applications beyond the tools.
So the very, very first language, if you was 15 years old starting out, what would be the first language you'd pick up today?
Back in the day, or if I was talking to a 15-year-old right now?
If you're talking to a young lad now, doesn't that
maybe JavaScript. I know. I think a lot of people would say that's an idiotic decision. I think JavaScript, it's getting bigger and bigger, and I think it's the most approachable. It's the easiest one where you can. If I were teaching my little brother right now, who's 15 years old, I would, of course, teach him HTML first and CSS. But then, when I start teaching him coding concepts, I would use JavaScript. Even for things like Chrome DevTools, they can open that up and immediately just toy around with it. You know, it's like you can instantly play around with the language versus something else where they have to learn how to install these tools. And then if it doesn't install correctly, you have to figure out these errors and all that crap. I would start with JavaScript.
Thank you. I was just going to just finish up with what you said, how, you know, people writing with jQuery and that they're not using vanilla JS, you know, plain old JavaScript. It's a bit like when you're driving a car these days, right? So you get on the highway and you put on a cruise control. And there's a lot of people these days, and I'm getting worse at it because I haven't driven a car without cruise control for probably 5 years now. And so you actually lose the ability to hold and maintain a consistent speed without cruise control. And I get real picky at people who don't have it on or don't have it. And I know that's pathetic, but it becomes unless, I mean, if you buy a newer car, they've all got cruise control, right? So it becomes a non-issue to need to know how to be really, really good at holding your speed without it, right?
Yeah.
That was like an analogy, I guess, I could put forth to the outside world for that. You don't need to know that, for example, adding event listeners, the Internet Explorer 8 has a different API to Internet Explorer 9, which has a different API to Mozilla and Chrome. It doesn't matter. You just call, document on blah, blah, blah. So.
And I wonder if it's kind of elitist too, like especially back in that 2008 phase when people were saying, oh, you have to do everything in jQuery, you're not a real developer. And it's like, you know what? jQuery exists because back then just writing vanilla JavaScript was a complete and total nightmare. It was so bad. It's much better these days. There are much better APIs available. Back then, it was awful. That's why jQuery and Prototype and MooTools back then were created, was to make it somewhat bearable, And so to make people feel bad that they were introduced to JavaScript through jQuery is just absurd.
Righty, mate. I think that's about all we've got time for. We've held you up for a whole hour. So
cool.
Yeah, thank you very much, mate. Appreciate it. And I'm sure everyone else here does. So yeah, thanks, mate. Cool. Righty, catch you later.
See you, Ben.